Okay, let's get started. My name's Robbie Satter. I'm here to present on Microsoft leveraging laaS for SharePoint and SQL on Azure. I also have Michelle, who's with me as well, to present on SharePoint and SQL as well.
Hi, everyone.
If you hold your questions until the presentation, there will be time for questions at that point. So let's get started. To give you a quick background about myself, I'm a practice lead here at Netrix. I joined last year. Prior to that, I worked at Microsoft for 7 years, starting in Microsoft Consulting Services, then moving over to the developer division where I worked on .NET 4, and then moved on to Azure App Platform, so the application platform portion of Azure with Scott Guthrie when he moved over to take over Azure App Platform, and spent 3 years working on Azure App Platform, including the open source strategy for Microsoft and actually open sourcing ASP.NET MVC Web API and web pages, entity framework, and a bunch of other stuff as well. So I thought I'd duck out before the open source assassins came after me. Just kidding. It was a strategy that was held all the way up to the top. So, but that's not why you're here. You're here to see about SharePoint and SQL. So we're going to talk about SharePoint and SQL on Azure and what you can do with those workloads, etc. So let's start with SharePoint. SharePoint in Azure, the big question that we get is why Azure instead of Office 365? And then how do I do SharePoint in Azure? And finally, what are some of the common workloads for SharePoint in Azure? Oops. So I kind of sum up the whole point of SharePoint in Azure as control. Pure and simple. With Office 365, you have control, but only as much as Office 365 gives you. So below a certain level, you can't do anything with SharePoint. So for example, add-ins to SharePoint you can't do. Any specific physical configurations with SharePoint you can't do. How it's set up, you can't obviously do. It's set up for you. And so at Office 365, the level of control is the software itself. With Azure, you can take that level of control down to the level of the OS. So you have full control over the OS, how it's set up, how it's configured, how SharePoint is set up, installed, and configured, what version, on up the stack. What you can't do is control the hardware, and we'll talk some more about that. Versus on-prem, where your control is all the way to the bottom of the stack, including hardware, how it's interconnected with other hardware, and the actual physical machines. That is versus cost. So the more control you have, the greater your cost. So Office 365, you have a pretty fixed price per user. That's your cost, and that's it. You don't have to worry about paying for licenses, hardware, running it, etc. Azure, same thing, except this time your cost is a little higher because you're paying for the OS and you're paying for the license of SharePoint and potentially SQL as well when we talk about SQL. And then at the bottom on-prem is the highest cost. There you've got to not only pay for hardware, but you've got to pay for the land, for where it's going to physically reside. You've got to pay for the electricity, the environment, environmental control costs, etc. So the more control, the greater the cost. Less control, the less the cost. And between the two extremes, kind of sits Azure. So it gives you a good amount of control without a lot of cost. And that's in the form of VMs and other services. So what are configurations do you actually have? You've got single tier, 2-tier, 3-tier configurations. Just like any SharePoint configuration. So you can configure it to be a single server or a set of servers spanning the globe in multiple data centers around the world and spread all over the place. So servers in Asia, Europe, South America, United States, Canada, etc. And then multiple webheads, multiple application tier, and clustered databases all over the place, and then maybe even synced. So it can get as complex or as simple as you want. There is one additional option in the configuration. A lot of people use domain controllers, Active Directory, to manage their servers, names, and access to those servers. In the case of Azure, you can either set up Active Directory on a VM, or you can use the Active Directory service that's built into Azure and do a sync between your on-prem Active Directory service and Azure and your SharePoint. It's similar to Office 365. So you've got lots of options there.
Robbie, I just wanted to point out too, in that 3-tier infrastructure for SharePoint as well, we can do several high availability types of groups with that. So we can have, not just 3-tier, but we could have 3 web servers, 3 app servers, pretty much supporting any of the current SharePoint infrastructures that we have in place or that are recommended by Microsoft.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So think of Azure IaaS as being essentially virtualized hardware in the sky, and you don't care where it is, or you can put it wherever you need, and your cost is compute, storage, and bandwidth usage. So it's basically based on your usage of the service. And then however you set that up is however you set that up. To actually create VMs is actually very darn easy. I'm not going to demo Azure creating a VM. I'm sure you've seen the demo a million times, and it's pretty boring. You select something, you put in the name, you hit go, and then it sits there and does its thing to provision the actual image. It's pretty boring. But what I do want to show you is you've got different OSs that are supported, and then you can choose the OS you want and then install SharePoint yourself. Or if you'll notice, the 5th option in this slide is actually an evaluation edition or a trial edition of SharePoint, and you can then upgrade that license with a new license key to make it a production version and not a trial. And so you can sit there and say, okay, I need 4 SharePoint servers, boom, boom, boom. I need 2 SQL servers, and you'll notice there's SQL images as well, and there's actually a whole bunch of them. I'll show you that later on. You set those up, boom. Then the only thing you have to do with the SharePoint images is configure the SharePoint. Now, sounds really easy, but if you've ever configured SharePoint, it's a lot of work. So, to the point where a lot of people use PowerShell. Guess what? You got PowerShell. So you can actually use PowerShell to not only configure the OS in SharePoint, but actually create the VM. So you can imagine, let's say I have 2 webheads, and I'm getting ready to hit the busy part of the year for my business and SharePoint utilization. So I want to spin up a third instance of SharePoint. Could actually have a PowerShell script and a pre-configured image that that script interacts with. Oh, thank you. So, sorry, I'm muting people. Can people hear me better now? Great, thanks, Ryan. So you can imagine a scenario where you run this PowerShell script, and the PowerShell script creates the VM, then it configures the OS for what it needs that it can't have predefined. Then it configures the SharePoint server for what it can't have predefined. And poof, within a few minutes, you have a third webhead going. And now you've gone from 2 to 3. And then when the busy season's over, you can turn that third webhead off, and you're no longer paying for that. And so now, instead of having to be at max scale year-round, you only have to be at the level you need for that part of the year. Scale up and then scale back. And there's even ways that you can set it up to automatically scale and run that PowerShell script when it detects, oh, we're getting really busy, let me spin up an additional instance. In addition, you can use it to do your maintenance. So Michelle's first name is PowerShell Queen.
No, I was just going to interject, unlike Office 365, where we really can't run PowerShell scripts on SharePoint, what's nice about Azure is that not only can we run PowerShell scripts, we can, write and run our own, and we do have that ability to connect to the OS. There are so many things in PowerShell that we're able to do in SharePoint that are more efficient than going through the UI. But I think this is an extremely important capability to have.
Yeah, exactly. And then couple that with the ability to create the machines on the fly, and you can have an extremely flexible environment, not only for your production environment, but for other uses as well. And what are those other uses? And that's where we get into workloads. So one of the best uses of Azure for SharePoint is actually taking this, let me back up, that evaluation edition of SharePoint, get an Azure demo account for 30 days free with $200 worth of usage. You can spin up that image, play around with it, and look at what's all new in SharePoint, in the new SharePoint version. You'll also notice in the SQL portion of this talk that there's CTPs of the next version of SQL already prepped for Azure, and so you can play with those as well. So evaluating software in a safe environment is a really good workload for Azure, which also goes back to dev test. So having a dev environment and a test environment that you can spin up and down, turn off, so that you're not paying for it constantly. Again, that whole, hey, if I have to have dev test, I now have to triplicate my hardware for supporting those needs. throughout the year. You don't have to do that with Azure. You only pay for what you use. Therefore, for example, you can have dev turned off during the night when no one's around, test turned off during the night when no one's around, on the weekends, etc., or holidays, and then turn it back on when people are around. And so your cost is much less. And another scenario with dev test that you've got is some developer decides, hey, I got an idea to do something that's really cool, let me do this, but it might take down the development environment, so let me spin up my own instance so that if I break it, if I break the SharePoint instance, I'm only messing up my work, not everybody else's, and taking everybody else down while I back it up to a point where it's usable again. So very, very flexible. Go ahead, Michelle.
Hi, I just wanted to interject too as far as dev test goes. You know, I have 10 developers on my team. This is so much easier to spin up a dev test environment for each of those developers and keep it isolated than it is for me to call my infrastructure department and ask them for 10 new servers, even if they're VMs. You know, I don't have to worry about getting approvals or software in place. I mean, there would be a certain bit of approval with our licensing, but online it's just extremely much more efficient to build these dev test environments, and even from a cost perspective as well.
Yeah, and actually Azure has tools to kind of give people budgetary restraints as well, so it doesn't spin out of control cost-wise. Another workload which is very useful is upgrade. With the new version of SharePoint, you don't upgrade the servers, you just upgrade the database. So you have to install a whole SharePoint environment, then upgrade the database, or copy up the database, and then upgrade that database, do your testing and go, yeah, that's going to work, we're all good. Now let me go set that up again. And so you can do it that way. Another way is if your production environment is actually in Azure, you've got your production environment running, you then do your upgrade, you got that running, you say, oh yeah, it looks all works, blah, blah, blah. Then you say, okay, on some weekend, we'll then do the final upgrade of the latest database, copy, reroute all the URLs at the routers at Azure's level to the new production servers, front ends, you're done. And then you can turn off that old production environment. You don't pay for it, but you can keep it around in case, oh, we run into problems and have to turn back the clock, so to speak. Or after a certain time you say, nope, we don't need those, we can now delete all those images. But in the meantime, you haven't been paying for double the hardware for running both your upgraded version and your old production version as well. So that's another really great usage of Azure and why you might want to move from on-prem to Azure. Anything else on SharePoint, Michelle?
As I stated, the dev test, I think the upgrade option in here too is extremely useful. We have so many upgrades going on right now from the 2010 environment to 2013. You know, this allows us a way to leave that 2010 environment in place in a very low risk scenario, and upgrading it, you know, up in the cloud, working out bugs and issues that we might have, and then bring that back down in one whole piece when we're ready to upgrade on premise. So this, you know, this has huge cost benefits as well as using on-premise upgrades. And you know, another thing I see this extremely handy for is to do any type of POCs that would go right into the test dev environment as well. It allows you a lot of freedom at a very cost efficient, or from a very cost efficient standpoint.
Yep, it does. let's talk about the one piece we kind of skimmed through with SharePoint, which is SQL. And with the SQL, there's actually there's two ways to run SQL in Azure. There's Azure SQL Database, and then there's SQL running as a VM, what I call SQL VM. And hold on a second. With the two versions, again, it's about control and the level of control you want. Now, with SharePoint, the recommendation is that you run SQL as a VM with SharePoint, but theoretically you could run Azure SQL Database with your SharePoint instances as well. It's just not the typical recommended environment right now. So let's look at, although I'm going to talk about Azure SQL Database first. So Azure SQL Database is just like Office 365, except instead of Office 365 and SharePoint, it's SQL Server. So it's a multi-tenant database in the cloud. The development is essentially the same. You send SQL statements to it, it works and returns you the result set that you want or does whatever you told it to do. And the pricing is based on storage usage per day. And what do I mean by that? So you have a database. Let's say you have a database that you process 5 days a month. Now, in the on-prem world, you'd have to have infrastructure to support that database every single day of the year. But with Azure SQL Database, you actually can just pay for the 5 days of usage. So let's say it costs you $1 a day based on your storage usage. You used it for 5 days, $5. That is very, very powerful. So I used it 5 days, I paid for 5 days. The rest of the time, it just is hibernating in the cloud, not doing anything, not being used, etc. Now, as with any service, there are limitations. Those limitations are as follows. One, you can't control the physical options. So you can't say, for example, create database with a database file name of blah on drive C or D or F or whatever. So you have no physical, you can't configure, you can't tell it the options for physical items. There's no backup and restore. And we'll get back to that in a minute. It currently supports the 2008 data types. And again, on the T-SQL, any physical options or parameters are not supported. Now, I did say there's no backup and restore. What the heck? What do I do with my data? How do I protect my data? Well, what you can do is copy that database and then export it to Azure storage. And in fact, there's a preview of doing that today. Instead of you manually doing that, you can set that up as an option on your database. What that does mean, though, is depending on how often you do those backups, you have a second copy of the database residing each time. So if you're doing a backup of your database every single day, unfortunately, it then means your cost for the database is doubled. However, if you're doing weekly database backups or monthly database backups, then you've got significant cost savings there, because then you're only having the database copied once for 1 day that week or that month, and then it's exported into Azure storage where it's sitting really cheaply at a really cheap rate. The max database size is 150 gigabytes, at which point you have to shard. So if you need more than 150 gigabytes, you've got to deal with sharding. Again, the Azure SQL database, I'm so used to saying SQL Azure. The Azure SQL database team has come up with federation, and that has a standard for sharding to make it easier for people to shard, but you live within their constraints. How do I create a database? It's pretty simple. You go create a database, you give it a name, you pick the edition, you fill out some parameters, and you go. So the web edition allows 1 gigabyte database or 5 gigabyte database, up to a max of 5 gigabytes. The business edition is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, or 150 gigabytes. Then in addition to having create the database, you have to create a database server, and I'll use server in quotes, so imagine me holding up my fingers quoting server. That's really not a physical server per se. It's essentially saying, here's a collection of databases that can be administered together within that one database server. So when would you use SQL, Azure SQL database? The first is apps you have source for. The reason why I say you have source for is because there's those limitations in the T-SQL that you can use, or the SQL you can use. And so if it's using a set of SQL that it can't use, then that's a problem. And so it may not work. And so you're more than welcome to try. People have tried and found out, oh, it's fine, and because a lot of developers don't put those physical options in the SQL within their code. It's typically select blah 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 from blah where blah, and so those kinds of SQL statements work, but sometimes there's additional things that's going on that won't work. When you want to have, again, when you want to have cost versus control, if you can live with less control for cheaper cost, it's a good usage. High availability. So, I said this is essentially SQL Server in the cloud. Well, it's more than just SQL Server in the cloud. Think of it as a SQL cluster in the cloud. And you can use it, and it'll grow and shrink as you need, both in terms of access, performance, and storage. However, there is a downside to this. I'm not saying this is how Azure SQL Database works. I'm using this as a metaphor for how it works. You can imagine it's multi-tenant. So essentially, you stick your SQL statement onto a queue, and then it's in line waiting to get processed. So if you've got a bunch of people in front of you, you'll get some latency in your returns. Also, if there are processes take a while, again, you can run into some problems there. Now, there are limitations in how long it'll let a query run before it just cuts it off and says, it's running too long, I'm going to cut it off. But again, you could have a whole bunch of them in front of you that aren't, and so it may be there may be some in latency, some variance in how the performance is there. One of the things they're testing now is being able to reserve performance and say, I want to reserve X performance. And so essentially what's ending up happening is you're running on essentially a private instance of Azure SQL database of some size. And there's constraints on there, and it's in test right now. So you can't just say, oh, I want a reserve instance of Azure SQL database, let me use that. If your data can be within 150 gigabytes or use sharding, then that's another good usage of Azure SQL Database. And then finally, if you don't want to deal with, or you have unpredictable performance and or scaling issues, then Azure SQL Database could be a good solution to that because it can grow and expand and shrink as needed based on what's going on. And you don't have to pre-predict, oh, I need to add another node to my cluster because I'm starting to run into performance issues, or I need additional performance, or I need to add additional disks because the file is growing. Okay, so that's Azure SQL Database. Now, how is that different from SQL on a VM? Well, in the case of SQL on a VM, it's just that. It's SQL running in a VM. It'd be no different than in your own on-prem solution saying, hey, I've got a virtual, I'm running Hyper-V, spin up a SQL instance and connect it and run it there. So you can run SQL 2008 or SQL 2012. There are actual templates for those already. If you use those templates, pricing then includes the licenses. So let's say you use Enterprise, it might be on an instance, it might be $2 versus $1 or 50 cents, whatever the pricing is. So you don't have to pay that upfront cost for all the licensing costs. So for example, the data enterprise version is, tens of thousands of dollars per core. You don't have to pay that. You're paying that out over time based on your usage of that VM. And if the VM is turned off, you don't pay for it. There are limitations. And in this case, the limitations, going back to that notion of control, the service is at the software level, VM is at the OS level, and so with a VM, you're not specifying, hey, I want these special solid state drives connected to the PCI bus directly, blah, 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 unless there's an instance that has that pre-configured. Or you can't say, oh, I want a SAN with fiber to run my multi-terabyte SAN against. So the physical hardware that you're running on, you can only say, oh, here's a template based on an instance size of what you get, but you can't specify specific hardware. Here's to get, again, not going to do a demo, and but to create a VM, there's actually a bunch of templates, and actually I'm only showing a few of them. You'll notice there's a scroll bar, so there's a bunch more as well. So different combinations of SQL Server additions on different combinations of hardware, and there's also SQL 2014 CTPs already out. That you can go and test and see what's going on with the next version of SQL, and are there features that you need for your app or apps that you're built or building. So when do you want to use these? So first off, it's really easy to just pick up your existing app and move it onto Azure in VMs. One of the last things I did at Microsoft before I left, one of my responsibilities was running ASP.NET and IIS.NET websites. And at the time I started, we were running in a third-party hosted environment with a company out in California. And we constantly got questions, why is that not running on Azure? And of course, we're going to move it to Azure, and we started that process. And the strategy was pretty simple. just pick up our servers, move them into VMs. Now, one other gotcha on that, they didn't exist at the time. And so we were one of the first people to start evaluating the VMs they were experimenting with and looking at it. The other thing that wasn't around were things like the AD service. And so, as you can imagine, as you peel back the onion on a third-party hoster, there's things they're doing that may not be a line item. So for example, I use the example of several years ago, you used to not pay for baggage on an airline ticket. You just got your baggage on. And so you would never think about that. So we never thought about, oh, what are all the things they're doing for us, like Active Directory, like backups and patching, etc. And so that's the one gotcha with just picking up your app and moving it. You've got to think through what's all the infrastructure required. And today, 99% of that infrastructure is probably now sitting in Azure today. I'm sure there's parts of exotic things that they haven't got a service for yet, but for the most part, it's all there. Backup, Active Directory, etc. So it's pretty easy to just lift it up and put it on and put it into VM. As of today, by the way, both those websites are running in Azure today with no change for running in Azure. If you want more control over your infrastructure and your SQL server, then SQL on a VM is the way to go. Again, you've got less limitations, so up to 16 terabytes, after which the machines themselves can't have that much storage on them, so you've got to start looking at sharding. The last thing to keep in mind is you've got to plan out your scaling. So if you're running SQL and you've got a cluster, say you've got a 4-node cluster, and now you're like, oh, the performance is getting bad. Whereas Azure SQL database would have just automatically added additional nodes as it needed it. In this case, you would have to say, oh, I now need that node, let me spin it up, integrate it in. So you've got to kind of plan ahead to know, hey, I need to do that. So that's that. I'm going to stop talking now and actually open it up for questions if people have questions. So you can either type them in or chat, turn off your mute and ask. Any questions?
Robbie, I'm trying to check. I'm echoing a lot here. Hyrule had a question that if SharePoint Foundation, SharePoint 2013 Foundation will run on Windows Azure, and yes, it will. I believe Azure supports both SharePoint Foundation and SharePoint Server. Hyrule also has a question here about what authentication methods are used by SharePoint with Azure. Normally, SharePoint supports Kerberos and NTLM. SharePoint and Azure will support NTLM over a claims-based authentication. And then as far as Kerberos goes, I will have to look that up unless Ryan or you might know that answer.
Yeah, I don't know the answer on that one. We'll need to get back to you on that. Any other, one piece of housekeeping item before I forget. If you reply back to the invite with your feedback to Pam Hoover, she will send you a $10 Starbucks card. So, other questions? I see see somebody typing a question. So Ray's asking, have you tested using SQL Azure as the storage for a SharePoint database? Yes, it actually has been done in the past, but I personally have not tested it. I do know people are doing that, but I haven't seen anybody with precision against SQL Azure. And usually it's the issue of latency. But we may start seeing that more prominently as this new Azure SQL database reservation or reserved instances rolls out into RTM. So, follow-up question from Ray, is there a specific version of SharePoint that we should get to before trying that idea of using SQL Azure as a DB store? So the SQL, what is it, SQL 2012? Is that the latest version, Michelle? I can never remember the numbering.
Yes, SQL 2012 is the latest version, and I also noticed that we have evaluation versions of SQL 2014.
Yeah, so 2012, people have tried on SQL Azure, or I'm sorry, Azure SQL Database. They changed the name on me, that's why I keep mixing them up. You can try the 2013 because there is a trial version of it. But the newer versions, I would not use the older versions at all.
And I believe the trial version of the SharePoint in Azure that you can get for free, you know, if you decide to go forward with that too, as far as upgrading that, it's all about just entering a license key.
Yeah. Yeah, once you decide that's what you want, change out the key and you're done. Okay, well, unless there's another question, I will, or you have another comment, Michelle, I'm going to call this webinar complete.
I just wanted to let Hyrule know I will get back to you on those authentication methods as well.
So thank you for coming and taking the time to come to this webinar. And again, if you reply back to Pam on the invite with your feedback about the webinar, which I would appreciate, she will be sending you a $10 Starbucks gift card.
Also, Robbie, quick question. Do we all have, does everybody have the link, or have we published the link to where they can go and get their free trial to try SharePoint in Azure?
Just go to windowsazure.com and you will get a 30-day trial with $200 of credit. It's right on the homepage. Big button. Lots of arguments about that big button. All right. I will stay on for a while if people want to ask questions, but thank you for your time. And we here at Metrics appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about SharePoint and SQL on Azure.
Yes, thank you, everybody.